Hello and welcome to CNBC-TV18 News Center. The first phase of the government's green hydrogen policy is expected this week. The centre expects the policy to be a game changer for India's energy security. Also, the green hydrogen policy is part of the government's larger vision of cutting India's dependence on fossil fuels. The Minister for Power and New Energy, R.K. Singh, has said the policy will focus on open access, banking support and free transmission. The first phase will not include viability gap funding and mandates for producers. This will be added in the second phase. Let me go across to our guest to discuss this hydrogen policy. Rajat Siksaria, the CEO of Acme Group, is joining us. The Acme Group has a hydrogen plant, a green hydrogen plant in Rajasthan. Debashish Mishra, partner at Deloitte, is also with us. Rajat, if I may begin with you, how will the first phase of this policy help green hydrogen manufacturers like you?
So thanks, Parikshit, for inviting me to the show. See, ideally, the government planned to announce a full integrated policy on hydrogen. This has been in the works for several months. But since this is a very unique sector which the government is trying to prop up, there are still bits of work which would require more industry consultation. So I think they have decided to go ahead with phase one to kind of further consolidate the policy direction that they are very, very serious about hydrogen. I am glad that some of the key demands industry had, including players like us, to enable these sectors like wheeling, banking, and waivers on transmission charge, is something which they have outright accepted, at least from what we believe and what we hear, is something which is likely to come in the first phase. So this kind of gives us solid grounds for players like Acme and other players in this space to start planning their business segments, start creating commercial structures around it, so that knowing that very soon there would be real bids, real business opportunities which would emerge for them to actually start making business investments in the sector. So in that sense, this gives a good policy direction, further thrust to the policy direction. But yes, it will also be important that mandates come in very soon, because that is where will underpin the real demand, which will be the basis of some of these projects taking off.
Right. So you're saying this gives a policy direction to green hydrogen manufacturers or companies looking to set up green hydrogen plants in the country. Debashish, if I begin with you, just let's look at some of the announcements, some of the points made by Mr. R.K. Singh. We're going to see the fine print very soon, but 30 days, free storage and transmission facility, uniform renewable purchase obligation mechanism, and allowing companies to set up renewable energy capacity or source energy from anywhere without transmission charges. How does all of this help the ecosystem or companies like Acme Solar and others who are looking to get into this space?
Yeah, so thanks for having me over, Parikshit. The advantage of these policy measures which are coming in the first phase will be the fact that, what is green hydrogen? Basically, you are through a process of, using electrolyzers, you are separating hydrogen and oxygen using water. And that's a very energy intensive process. And currently, most of it is already happening through natural gas, what we call the gray hydrogen. So during this process of using renewable energy to produce green hydrogen, the source of that green power, whether it is solar or wind, one, it will be intermittent, and it may not be at the place where the electrolyzers will be used or the demand point. Let's say there is a refinery in Panipat, whereas the energy can be sourced from Ladakh or, let's say, Rajasthan. So the advantage is that you can transmit the green power to the usage point, because at such, when you produce hydrogen is such an element, it is highly inflammable, and transportation itself will be very difficult. So this policy definitely will be, as Rajat just mentioned, it will help the players to start organizing themselves in terms of where to produce the green power, where to put up the electrolyzer plant, where will be the user units. So definitely this gives that, planning phase, so to say, for players to work out the logistics and map out their investments.
Right. So this will give some policy direction to companies to map out their investments. Let me get in Rajat once again. Rajat, now, when it comes to phase two, that will address viability gap funding, but that part of the policy will also require cabinet approval. Give us a sense of what kind of monetary support does the industry need, and how critical will phase two be for you?
Yeah, so I think phase two is the real, business end of this policy cycle on green hydrogen, if I can use that word, because even today, this is a unique combination of electrical engineering and chemical engineering coming to produce green hydrogen and maybe even ammonia, which is competing with a completely different way of producing the same fuel, whether it is hydrogen and ammonia, which is using natural gas, using steam methane reforming, right? So what we don't know right now is what would exact economics would be. And the reason we don't know that is not because we are not certain of the cost on this cycle, on the green cycle, is because the alternate is dependent on, let's say, natural gas. And natural gas prices, as we all know, has been very volatile. So, so that is why the economics of an alternate fuel is right now determining the economics of an alternate mode of supplying to the industry. So at that stage, in our calculation, what we would require from government has to be not necessarily financial support for Indian market. It has to be more about obligations for certain sector, certain hydrogen purchase obligations, similar to what we did in the national solar mission when we started the solar sector. We started with 2%, 5%, and in some cases now it's 15 to 20%. That will be required to address the domestic market. But there is another very important market which we believe is going to be earlier than the domestic market, which is the international market. For that, we have been certainly recommending to the government that we should come up with a PLI equivalent policy for hydrogen to export it. And PLI should not be for an intermediate product, for the final product, that is hydrogen or ammonia. That is where they should come out with PLI, because that straight away opens up a huge international market for Indian players to jump into.
Right. So that is an important point, isn't it, Debashish, what Rajat was saying, that we need demand for it. We need uniform purchase obligations across the country. We need certain commitments. How do you see the penetration of green hydrogen in manufacturing increasing over the next 5 years?
See, the entire segment is called the hard to abate segment, where basically, globally, if you see whatever energy uses can be electrified, that's being electrified, and that electricity can be supplied from, either wind, solar, or any of those green sources. And that's how the world is moving towards the net zero. But there are many usages which cannot be converted, and that's called the hard to abate sector. And as Rajat was expecting, the core of this policy would be some of the early sectors where government is expected to mandate, is sectors like refinery, sectors like city gas distribution, or your green ammonia in fertilizer. That will be probably the first phase. And more process driven changes will happen in a more medium to longer term in sectors like steel and cement. There it will be probably a decade down the line. So what is expected is that the current usage of hydrogen in segments like fertilizer and the refinery, which is around 6.5 million tons, that's expected to go to around 9 to 10 million tons by the end of this decade. If you set in the renewable purchase obligation, a certain percentage you have to buy from these sources, because obviously the delta between the gray hydrogen and the green hydrogen is still very high. And that delta, economically, unless a user is asked to do that, that may not happen. So that has to be a policy-driven initiative. So what we are expecting is that in the next phase, there will be two elements. One is help on the manufacturing side, as it was mentioned, some PLI scheme either on mostly around electrolyzers. And second, the obligation in some of the user industry to start having a certain percentage of their hydrogen sourced from green hydrogen. That's what is expected in the next phase, and that will be core to the policy.
All right, we're running out of time on this segment. Thank you very much, Debashish and Rajat, for joining us, giving us your sense on what RK Singh has said about phase one of this policy. Singh, Power Minister and Renewable Energy Minister, with my colleague Anshu Sharma, saying that free transmission facilities will be given for 25 years. Transmission cost will be very low. States will be able to avail the RPO facility as well. Let me get in quick reactions from Hemant Malia of CEW and Debashish Mishra of Deloitte, who are with us on the phone. Hemant, let me begin with you. You may have been hearing Minister RK Singh as well. How do you see some of the contours of this policy?
Thank you very much for having me. I think it's a very welcome first move, specifically because when you look at green hydrogen, about 60 to 70% of the cost of producing hydrogen comes from power, and a significant portion of that power cost is also the open access charges. So it's a very good first move. Having said that, what we need to recognize also is that there are two types of charges. One is at a central level and another is at the state level. So whereas the state level charges are still there, the central ones have been waived off. So there is a significant disparity between states in terms of what they charge for open access, and it could distort the markets in the future. So what we need to look out for is in some ways to balance out or make it uniform across states so that there are no barriers for distributed generation of green hydrogen.
All right, so we need to have uniformity across states. Debashish, any surprises here? Any points that you would like to highlight? The minister has spoken about open access shall be granted to allow transmission through states. Government will set up a centralized portal for applications. Ease of doing business will be focused upon. Storage facilities at ports to further facilitate exports as well.
So, Parikshit, we just spoke an hour back expecting this policy, and it is as per the expectation. The phase one is as what was expected in terms of providing the mostly the transmission infrastructure. As we were discussing, many of these user units will be in places where you cannot put up large renewable capacity, and they may be placed anywhere, whether it is Rajasthan or Ladakh, Leh, and you can transmit it for 25 years free of cost. That's a big benefit to all the users, and the suppliers. Entire ecosystem will benefit out of it. But again, the core of this policy will be coming in the second phase, which will have manufacturing incentive, whether it is viability gap funding, a PLI for electrolyzers, and the second part will be mandating user segments to use certain percentage of their hydrogen sourced from green hydrogen. That will be central to the overall green hydrogen policy of the government.
Right. And Hemant, if I can get you in at this stage, the minister is saying that there is a strong demand pipeline, especially from foreign countries. They want to tie up with India. This has been the subject of several trade negotiations as well. How long do you think the green hydrogen manufacturing can take off in India in the right earnest? There are a few players in this space, but how long before we can achieve significant scale for exports as well?
So I think, it's in a couple of years, and I say that primarily because we have to have some amount of electrolyzer capacity. So electrolyzers are equipment that are used to convert water into hydrogen and oxygen. We need significant scale. From our estimates, if India has to displace all of its hydrogen that it is using currently, that is manufactured or produced using natural gas, and replace it with green hydrogen, we need an annual capacity of about 18 gigawatts of electrolyzer capacity, whereas we have only about half a gigawatt. So significant scaling has to happen. Now, of course, we can always import those electrolyzers, but that's not a preferable option if we are looking at a longer term play in this space. Having said that, export is probably the lowest hanging fruit, because if you think in terms of clean energy, when we are at the early stages for development of a new pathway, just like we did more than a decade ago on solar, what is important is you need off-takers or people who will buy your volumes at a premium. Now, that is very difficult in India because at present, the cost of green hydrogen is about 6 times that of coal on an energy basis, or maybe 3 to 3.5 times that of natural gas. So we don't have the immediate ability to absorb a lot of green hydrogen, but there are European countries, there is Japan and South Korea who don't have sufficient renewable energy capacity to generate power and then green hydrogen, and they are looking for imports into their country, and therefore we can be the early player, and that would also help develop our own ecosystem domestically. So that is why we need to look at exports as a first measure in terms of building the ecosystem.
All right, so exports will have to be the low-hanging fruit. We have to look at the first step for the local manufacturing to take off. Hemant Malia, Debashish Mishra, thank you very much for joining us here on News Center.